I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. From October 20th to 23rd, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party held its fourth plenum in Beijing, marking an important moment as the party sets the direction for China's development for the next 5 years. The session adopted recommendations for the 15th five-year plan, endorsing Xi Jinping's goals of high-quality development, scientific and technological self-reliance, and strengthening national security in response to rising global instabilities. The Central Committee also announced the replacement of 11 members, the highest personnel turnover since 2017, amid an ongoing anti-corruption purge in the military. To discuss the plenum's outcomes, we're joined today by Jonathan Czin. John is a leading expert on Chinese politics and foreign policy. He holds the Michael H. Armacost Chair in Foreign Policy Studies and is a fellow in the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. He previously led the intelligence community's analysis of Chinese politics and policymaking at the CIA, and he spent 2 years as director for China at the National Security Council during the Biden administration. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, John.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, first, how significant is the Fourth Plenum historically within China's political cycle? And how does this session differ from prior Fourth Plenums in the topics that were discussed and the timing and the significance?
Yeah, so typically the Fourth Plenum actually usually focuses on issues of governance and frequently of party governance in particular. But part of what happened with this plenum is that Xi, because of some of his earlier machinations in this cycle, has kind of distorted the plenum cycle, right? It's typically the fifth plenum where the Chinese Communist Party ends up focusing on outlining its five-year plan. And I think to understand what happened, you have to rewind the movie a little bit. There was supposed to be a third plenum in 2023, but what we saw instead was that Xi convened a foreign affairs work conference, which actually in retrospect makes a lot of sense and I think is a reflection of Xi's priorities at the time. Beijing knew it was heading into a potentially tumultuous year in its foreign policy with both an election in Taiwan and an election here in the United States, right? So I think where that leaves us now, and I think what's kind of interesting and peculiar in this moment is that at the end of the cycle, when we get to the next party Congress in 2027, we'll either have one fewer plenum, or one theory that I've heard rumored is that Xi now has a quote-unquote pocket plenum, right, where he can make additional personnel moves or send some other kind of big signal into the system. And so these meetings traditionally are the most important meeting of the year on China's political calendar. But as I noted, I mean, the fact that there are these other meetings like the Foreign Affairs Work Conference, or last year there was a major meeting for the military high command in Yunnan, there are these other irregular meetings that Xi has populated the political calendar yet that are also extremely consequential. So again, all of this illustrates the ways in which Xi has kind of broken the old rules of the game in Chinese politics and then think to his own priorities and predilections.
So I mentioned at the top some of the themes that were highlighted in the Communique, of course, which was issued toward the end of the plenum. There was nothing that really jumped out at me as particularly surprising, and I've read some things that other analysts have written. There's going to be other podcasts, of course, about the outcomes of the Fourth Plenum. What stood out to you, and was there anything that surprised you?
Yeah, I think my main takeaway from the plenum proceedings and from the communique is that there's this really jarring juxtaposition right now in Chinese politics between policy continuity on the one hand and this high drama on the personnel side, right, where you have these extensive purges, both on the military side and on the civilian side as well. And so that to me struck me as one of the real key themes. I mean, looking at the document and the text yourself, I agree with you, Bonnie. I think there are some subtle shifts in emphasis, but I frankly don't know how meaningful those are going to be once we get to the point of, further elaborating the five-year plan next spring and actually implementing this. Right. And I don't think the drama that we saw on the personnel side was necessarily surprising. Right. A lot of these people had been removed from position or been conspicuously absent for much of the past year. Our colleague John Culver had a great line. For many of these people, these guys have gone from MIA to KIA now.
I like that. So let me ask you then a question about I think the most prominent, maybe also most significant of the personnel changes was the appointment of General Zhang Shengmin. He's been elevated, of course, to vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, and he's the secretary of the CMC's Commission for Discipline Inspection. So what, if anything, does this appointment tell you about Xi Jinping's goals with the military? Does he have any prior relationship with Xi Jinping? And are you surprised that there weren't additional appointments on the Central Military Commission?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zhang Shengmin, and we laid this out in our piece, was kind of one of the obvious candidates for elevation to the Central Military Commission, just because he was one of the few remaining full members of the Central Military Commission left. And traditionally, you go from being CMC grade to vice chairman grade in the system. It's unusual to have somebody pole vault up in the system. So in that sense, it's quite sensible. And the other thing that I think hews to tradition is that, typically in the past, before the last couple of Xi Jinping's terms, is that the two vice chairmen had kind of two distinct roles. You usually had somebody with an operational background and somebody from the political commissariat. And that hasn't been the case for the last couple times around, but now with the elevation of Zhang Shengmin, it looks more traditional in that sense. So that is where there's kind of some continuity, some abiding by the old rules of the game. But this is a very peculiar move in other ways. I think there are a few things that stand out to me. Number one is that Zhang Shengmin was elevated to vice chairman, but they also, as you noted, kept his role as head of the discipline inspection for the commission for the military, which strikes me as very unusual, right? The other thing that they did not do in this instance is concurrently elevate him to the Politburo, right? And I've really struggled to think of another time where that's happened, where a CMC vice chairman is not concurrently a member of the Politburo. And the plenum is the place to do that. That's the only place you can do it according to the party constitution. So that strikes me as strange. And now if you look at the composition of the Central Military Commission, it seems rather odd, right? It's kind of this oval shape where you have Xi Jinping at the top, you have the two vice chairmen, Zhang Shengmin and Zhang Youxia, and then you have Liu Jianli, right, the chief of the general staff, as the one full member, right? So it's odd because if you look at the longer arc of Xi's tenure, he has tried to kind of, I think, rationalize the structure of the PLI high command going back to his reforms in 2015 and 16. And this doesn't look like a rational structure, especially because, and this is the last point I'll make on this front, there's an important gap here. I really expected, the one job that I thought really needed to be filled going into this plenum was Miao Hua's job, right? The head of the political work department. And they didn't replace Miao Hua. So now you have this vacancy for what's really a crucial role inside the system for ensuring the party's loyalty, the military's loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. And to me, that is kind of mystifying. And I think what it suggests is that there's further purges to come, especially in that part of the party apparatus, right? That they don't feel like they've got somebody clean that they can put into that position. As far as Zhang Shengmin's connections to Xi, there are some people who think that potentially there's some nexus because Zhang Shengmin is from Shanxi province, and that's where Xi's father came up, and that maybe through the old field army system from China's Civil War, there's some kind of nexus. That to me feels tenuous, right? Like you kind of got to get there through the transitive property of Chinese politics to make that connection, right? And I think the prevailing theory for earlier in Xi's time was that people who came up through the 31st Group Army, where Xi actually would have had a lot of contact or some contact with those officers potentially earlier in his career, would have been a defining feature of Chinese politics. But now all those people, including He Weideng most notably, have been ousted. Right. So as far as the theory of Chinese politics and how these networks work in the system right now, I don't know that necessarily has a lot of predictive value. And the fact that Zhang Shengmin is not concurrently on the Politburo is not exactly a vote of confidence either.
Let's shift to some of the economic signaling. The joint communique called for building a robust domestic market and increasing domestic demand, but it didn't lay out any specific measures that China would pursue toward these goals. So how do you interpret that? Do you think that the 15th five-year plan will lay out very concrete actions that will really attempt to shift to a more consumption-led growth economy? Or are we just seeing some language that actually won't be followed up by concrete policies?
I'm more in the latter camp. I mean, they've been talking about this for most of the past year, especially since the last plenum, about giving a greater priority to enhancing the domestic market and especially boosting domestic consumption. But there's been very little follow through throughout this past year, right? And I feel like a lot of observers have gotten excited each time they promulgate one of these documents, and then there's very meager follow through. You either get some nibbling around the edges with pilot programs or some transfers, but no kind of systematic effort. I also thought it was striking looking at the document too, is that while this was a priority, it does not enjoy the same priority that we've seen boosting domestic consumption get in those party documents over the past year, where it's been number one. All of which makes me think that, part of what may be motivating this perhaps is more an effort to palliate the population than to pivot meaningfully on the policy front. I think as far as this question of domestic consumption goes too, I am very fond of the case that has been put out by the folks at Trivium and Andrew Polk and Denny McMahon, that they want to get there eventually, but that China in the meantime is actually in fact, if not in name, rejecting this consumption-led approach, right? That if they are going to get there, it's going to be over a longer time horizon, and that it's going to be really led by supply. And I think that makes sense to me. I mean, part of the issue here is that, especially now in the wake of COVID, the PRC just doesn't have the fiscal space to do this, right? To expend the resources and have the kind of wealth transfer. And I think Xi has been quite explicit that he's loath to, perhaps for some ideological reasons, expand China's welfare commitment. But it also makes sense just from a financial perspective. Why take on additional commitments in terms of expanding the welfare safety net when you know this demographic crunch is coming and it's about to get a lot more expensive? And I think he's very hesitant to do that at this point.
There really weren't any details about the 15th five-year plan. Is that typical at this point? The plan obviously will cover 2026 to 2030, and we will know more when it's approved by the National People's Congress next year. But did you expect that there would be a little bit more sort of hints as to what would be in the plan? Or is this exactly what you expected? Are we going to see any more, or do we wait until March before we see more details?
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily surprised by the lack of specificity, just given where we are in the process, right? These are the proposals, and we'll define the parameters and priorities for the plan going forward. Luckily for us China watchers, we won't have to wait all the way until March to get further signals from the leadership. There will be in just about 6 or 7 weeks or so, there will be a Central Economic Work Conference at the start of December, right? Which I think will further refine a lot of what we see here. So I think we'll get additional refinements. But I think, again, the big picture, like we talked about earlier, is that we're in the middle of Xi Jinping's third term, and I think he feels very comfortable with the trajectory he has China's economy on. And so this is a very much a stay the course kind of document. The last point I would make is that, I think the 5-year plan rightly deserves a lot of the attention that it's been getting. But I think one of the things that's been notable in the last couple of years, too, is that we have seen the party promulgate some additional plans for dealing with issues that are more in the medium term, like 3-year plans for dealing with the problems associated with involution, and then embedded with that, 2-year plans focused on specific sectors.
I want to ask you, sort of pulling back a little bit, a broader question about what you see as Xi Jinping's confidence in China's development model, and that it's on this path toward national rejuvenation, that he will be able to really continue to keep China in this position of being very strong, keeping its economy growing, hitting the target of around 5%. Maybe that's like sort of what I expect that it will be, like, as it was last time. The people that I've talked to, the Chinese experts that I've seen, and I'm sure you talked to many, have really just struck me as conveying this level of confidence that I have not really seen in my decades of dealing with people from China. There's always been a little bit more modesty, maybe a little bit more humility, and always some degree of insecurity as well. And so how do you look at this? How confident do you think Xi Jinping is in these actions that he has taken? And of course, in particular, in really continuing to be dominant in the really core areas of technology that he sees as so crucial to keeping China and narrowing the gap really between U.S. power and Chinese power and catapulting China eventually maybe to the top of the international order.
Yeah. I think you're right. The uptick in confidence is market, and my sense is, especially because this is now being embedded in the 5-year plan, is that this is not a tactical document, right? This isn't just about the upcoming Trump-Xi meeting or where we are in this current moment, but this is really laying out, I think, the party's feelings and its assessment, more importantly, of its objective state in this communique and in this document, right? And I do think there's a little bit of a shift from where we were even a year ago. I think where there was more anxiety in people we would talk to on the Chinese side, and I think there has been a shift, and I think you see that reflected in the plenum communique. There is still acknowledgement of the challenges, but I think that the communique is quite explicit about this. We should have confidence that we can surmount these challenges, right? And what was really striking to me overnight, Bonnie, is what happened at the press conference that accompanied the communique, right? Because I think that confidence that was already there in the document, it was there, but I think it was a little more subtle. And in the press conference, some of the officials were much more pronounced in their confidence, right? So you had one official from the Central Commission on Economics and Finance saying China is well positioned to take the initiative in shaping the external environment and expanding its international room for maneuver, right? That is very striking, right? And then you had another quote from the Ministry of Commerce citing Xi Jinping, saying Xi Jinping has emphasized that in the past our opening up was about running behind or following, but now our opening up must take the lead, right? And I think that is a really striking contrast, that they really do feel good about the progress that they've made just over the course of this past 5-year plan. And even just in the past year, like I said, I mean, there was anxiety about a year ago. There was more anxiety. And I kind of suspected, given the problems that were going on in the property sector, there seemed to be a mismatch, right? That Xi Jinping seemed very confident that we are on the right course. And his lieutenants would echo that sentiment as well. But then when you talk to the people that you and I would interact with, academics, think tankers, or, even, occasionally people on the street, there was more anxiety. My joke was, yeah, she feels good about this, but, his vice ministers who actually have to deal with these problems on a daily basis are probably slowly growing ghostless at home as they have to deal with the mounting bad economic data. But that mood seems to have really shifted now.
I wonder if part of this is messaging, because it takes place on the eve of what is likely to be a summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump in South Korea. Do you think that this is part of why the Chinese are exuding this great confidence in their own system and their standing in the international community, the favorable environment? I think they also believe it largely. And some people think that they are overconfident and that there will be some implications of that as well. But what do you think?
I think there is some of that, right? I think even with the timing now, traditionally these kind of plenums typically occur around this time frame, October, maybe November. But my strong suspicion is that the timing of the plenum was designed for maximum political choreographic effect by Xi Jinping, right? To have the plenum just a week before Xi is supposed to meet with President Trump, I think that only augments Xi's aura of authority both at home and abroad. And there's going to be a jarring juxtaposition if and when they meet next week, where Xi has just laid out this vision for China's economy and society for the next 5 years. And, unfortunately on our side, the U.S. government will probably still be closed. Right. And you see that already funneling into some of the PRC propaganda at this point. So I think there's an element of it, but I think the confidence that we've seen from China, especially in the past month or so, and with some of the big moves they've made on the chessboard, like rolling out these rare earth export controls just weeks before the meeting, I think it shows that confidence and the moves are downstream of the assessment, basically. Right? They have this confidence. They've taken a look at the situation, and now they think, yes, now is the time for us to take the initiative. Right? And I think that is a big part of what's been driving it. Like, this to me feels very much in the last few weeks in the run up to this meeting, I feel like Xi Jinping has moved from playing defense for most of the past year and reacting to U.S. policy moves to now he's playing offense. Right? And I think what's disconcerting to me is I try to think about analogs for this moment. Number one, it feels to me a lot more like the run-up to the China-EU summit, where Chinese diplomats, frankly, kind of roughed up and mistreated a lot of their European counterparts, right? And were quite tough on them in those negotiations. And over a longer arc, this to me feels like a lot more like the Xi Jinping we saw in his first term. Right, where when I was in government at the time, a lot of us had to wake up each day and worry about what moves Xi Jinping was making that were going to derail the rest of our days.
I want to ask you about the language in the communique about the international situation, as this is something that I think you and I always pay quite close attention to. And in the past, the Chinese have used language such as turbulent or complex, sometimes grave, even to describe the international situation. And at this particular moment, the Fourth Plenum communique says, we must maintain strategic resolve, enhance our confidence of success, proactively identify, respond, and steer changes, which goes to your point about Xi Jinping being more assertive. Mm-hmm. And demonstrate the courage and competence to struggle. And then it says we must have the courage to face major tests amid high winds, rough waves, and even raging storms, and tackle difficult risks and challenges with a spirit of historical initiative. So how do you place that in the context of what they've said previously? Yes, it definitely looks to me like it's more sort of proactive and more assertive. Mm-hmm. What else do you see there?
I think the tone is also milder, right? And I mean, there is some stark language in there that they've used before about the stormy weathers and choppy seas. But, the overall message from that passage you just read, Bonnie, is that, yeah, there's going to be problems, but we can manage them, and we should remain self-assured in our ability to manage those problems, right? And I think what's striking too is that, there's additional language from the communique where they talk about the solid foundation that they're on. Right. And I don't think you saw that in the analogous last communique from Xi's previous term. Right. They say quite explicitly, our economy is on solid foundations, demonstrating advantages in many areas, strong resilience, and great potential. Right. So I think there's an acknowledgement both on the home front and also in their assessment of the international scene. Yes, there are real challenges, but at this moment in time, we are well equipped to navigate those challenges.
So finally, let's talk a bit about the upcoming summit between Trump and Xi Jinping. And maybe you can give us some scenarios of what you think actually might come out of the summit. And I guess, a really interesting question that I have is what you think China wants out of it. I think China is always concerned about the optics, how their leader is treated. That's one thing. And they're probably not getting the kind of assurances and very predictable plans that the Biden administration would engage with them on, that I think enabled them to have some confidence that the reputation image of their leader would be protected. So, probably optics is one. But to what extent do you think that Xi Jinping does want stability in the U.S.-China relationship, and at what cost?
Yeah, if I can put it a little starkly, I think Xi is at a point, just given how volatile the Trump administration is in its decision-making, where his focus is not necessarily on stability per se, it's about control. Right. And I think that's a useful framework for understanding what happened again with those rare earth export controls earlier this month. If Xi had wanted stability in the bilateral relationship, that is not the move he would have made. Right. And I'm frankly, my operating model before that moment, and I think for a lot of people in town, was that the name of the game was to string Trump along for as long as possible. Right. And just keep him invested in the process. So I do think there has been a real shift there. And I think in terms of the meeting, I think the fact of the meeting they find useful. I think they see it as potentially muffling whatever kind of retaliatory measures or delaying at least the Trump administration might impose, right? Because they are banking on the fact that Trump wants this meeting so badly. I think aside from the meeting itself and using it to their own advantage, it's not clear to me that they actually really want much from this meeting. Right. I think if they're able to maintain the ceasefire or somehow restrain the administration, I think that is useful. Maybe they will push for more. And there have been rumors about that. I think that is a real policy that they'll push for additional concessions. But again, I think they feel like time is on their side. And my suspicion is still what they're banking on is drawing this game out until as close as possible to the midterm elections next year. I think that they calculate that will augment their leverage, and that Trump might even start negotiating against himself as we get closer to the midterms and wants something bigger and grander to show. I would say too, just to take a step back and look at the run up to this, so much of the focus has been on some of the provocative moves that the Trump administration has made toward China. But I think from Beijing's perspective, I think the bigger storyline after the de-escalation following Liberation Day was not the Trump administration's efforts to provoke China, but actually their efforts to mollify them over the past 6 months. Right? Especially by making concessions through the summer on technology issues and gestures of support for Taiwan, both of which, a year ago had been the focal points of tension in the bilateral relationship. Right? And I would also note, too, that from Beijing's perspective, the Trump administration has kind of suffered from, what I've been calling trade myopia, or maybe trade and tech myopia. And so we're not talking about some of the thornier problems in the relationship, like the security issues like South China Sea, the increasing pressure on Taiwan. So it's a very truncated bilateral agenda. And I think that all fed into Xi's calculation that he could make this big move in the run up to the summit. And that I think it was a calculated risk. I don't think it was necessarily overconfidence. I think he knew it could jeopardize the meeting. But I think what they are banking on is, and what they learned from the post-Liberation Day climb down, is that the U.S. side is not going to have the stomach to go through another period of escalation. Right. So the U.S. does have cards we can play, but there's two ways to play poker, and I am a terrible poker player, but I know enough that you can play the cards, and the U.S. does have some good cards you can play, or you can play your opponent. Right. And I think Xi is right now focused on playing his opponent.
I wonder though if even though that Xi Jinping, I think, is extremely confident, I wonder though if he and overall the Chinese side is concerned about the risks. That Trump has come out and made some demands in the run-up to the summit, and he wants the expeditious delivery of the rare earths, and he wants major Chinese movement on fentanyl, and he wants the Chinese to stop stop buying oil from Russia. And he wants China to buy American, soybeans from American farmers. And so he's making lots of demands, and clearly Xi Jinping doesn't want to give without getting. And if he doesn't give anything and Trump doesn't get what he wants, there is a risk that Trump gets angry. And we see that when Trump has gotten angry in the past, how he has turned, for example, against Putin, although now he may be going back to seeing Putin as a friend.
Yeah.
And the Chinese know very well what happened in the first term when after the outbreak of COVID, and Trump decided, largely perhaps for political reasons, to take a much tougher stance against China. So I guess my final question would be, do you think that China is concerned that this could really go badly?
Potentially, I think there is a risk of that, but I think again the two questions then, if Trump does turn on them, how long does it last? Especially as China starts to retaliate and inflict pain on the U.S. economy, right? My model for the tools that they've been using is that it's a switchblade, it's not a broadsword, right? They don't want to destroy the economic relationship with the United States, but they do want to inflict targeted pain, especially on the tech sector, and I think you see that come through. So I think that is one key variable that they are really banking on, right? Okay, even if there is a retaliation, will it just blow over because President Trump is so eager for a deal? And I think there are probably concessions that they might be more willing to make, like soybeans could be an easy one for them, right? And I think that was part of why they were willing to make concessions on things like TikTok too, right? I mean, that's an easy card for the Chinese side to play because it's a lot more important to us than it is for the Chinese. And again, I think the TikTok deal illustrates China's broader tactics in these negotiations, right? They are playing a distraction game, right? Notionally or ostensibly, what animated the trade war in the first place were some of these deeply embedded structural imbalances between the two economies. And from as far as I can see, we're not really making progress in actually even discussing those issues. Instead, the Trump administration is kind of playing this game of whack-a-mole where they're focused on either specific sectors like soybeans or specific firms like TikTok, rather than addressing those kind of bigger and meatier macroeconomic or trade issues. And I think that's intentional from China's side, right? That every time, they advance the conversation or there's another cycle of de-escalation, they'll introduce some new problem that will then preoccupy the Trump administration so that they never actually get to the bigger, more strategic issues.
All right. I look forward to see what happens on the other side of this summit. I'm sure we'll be in touch and exchange views. Thank you so much. We've been talking with Jonathan Czin, who holds the Michael Armacost Chair in Foreign Policy Studies and a fellow, of course, with the Thornton China Center, both at the Brookings Institution. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.